Good evening. This is Miss Bidwell coming at you with another screencast from Chapter 15, Section 3. Remember that I told you that we were going to be skipping around a lot in this chapter, and we're really going to be combining aspects of Chapter 15 and 16. I wanted to open with an introduction. The main idea that we're going to be talking about today is how industrialism and urbanization changed American society's ideas and culture in the late 1800s. And the focus of this particular screencast is going to be how it changed the lives of workers as they shifted from artisans or working in the workshop to factory workers. And you're going to find that they have more free time on their hands. So moving on. Okay, so we've been talking about, during this entire time period, about this shift in American society from a nation of farmers to an industrial nation focused where people now are starting to work in factories and we have mass production, and it's changing our way of life. In 1873, you heard the fast-talking guy talking about this novel written by Mark Twain and Charles Warner called The Gilded Age, and this was a criticism of the time period because these authors were trying to sound an alarm about some of the corruption and some of the problems going on beneath the surface, because on the surface it seemed that people were making more money, people were able to buy all of these mass-produced goods, people were able to shop in department stores, and things seemed to be going much better, but not really. There's still going to be a lot of problems beneath the surface. Now, keep in mind, we're still talking about the time period from roughly 1870 to 1900 after the Civil War. So, keep in mind that industrialization and urbanization caused Americans to look at society in a different way. We start to look at art in a different way, music, theater, all different forms of entertainment. One of these is going to be this strong belief in individualism. And individualism has been a large part of the American psyche and the American society for a very long time. And this is the idea that regardless of your background, you could still rise in society. And this gave rise to this idea from rags to riches. We see that in today's economy. I don't know how many students have told me in the past that they're going to be the next rap star, the next movie star, the next football, basketball, soccer star, and they're going to rise up and be very wealthy. And that certainly is attainable in American society. And out of this idea is this strong belief in the individual that we do not have any hindrances caused by class. There's nothing blocking us from attaining our goals other than just simply our hard work. Now, back in the day, during the 1870s to 1900, Horatio Alger was an author and minister in Massachusetts, and he sold these dime store novels about rags to riches stories. And it's always these stories about somebody starting out on their own. They overcome all of these obstacles and problems, but they are able to succeed, and they were immensely popular during this time period. So my question to you is, why did Mark Twain and Charles Warner call the era from about 1870 to around 1900 the Gilded Age? I also want to point out to you that this question is important because you will see it again on the test. And keep in mind, I told you that they were trying to sound an alarm about the time period. They were trying to warn people that although things looked very good for our economy and for our country on the surface, there were still a lot of problems underneath the surface, such as corruption, poverty, crime, violence, pollution. All of these things were going on underneath the surface. And keep in mind, to be able to explain this, you have to have an idea of what the concept of gilded means. And gilded refers to having something covered in gold on the outside, while the inner material is cheaper. You may have experienced this with maybe some cheap jewelry. Or you may have heard about how the palace walls at the Palace of Versailles in France, when you learned about this in the 9th grade, were gilded with gold. Okay, so popular culture is going to change during this time period. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the screencast that entertainment is really going to be a new thing for Americans. Prior to this shift to industrialism, you worked on the farm, and the farm consumed your every waking moment. You had chores that you had to do. You had animals to take care of. You had crops to take care of. You interacted with your family. They were your source of entertainment. You did not necessarily go out, as they say, but we're going to see these changes start to take place during this time period. One of those reasons is that people have more time due to the factory clock. People have more time. And then also they have more money to spend on entertainment and recreation. So work becomes separate from the home, and people start to look for ways to have fun by going out to public entertainment. Now, I do need to point out to you that the saloon, which was back in the day like a bar, for the lack of a better way to describe it, it was like a community and political center for male workers, and that's important because we talked about the political machine, and that's what the political machine worked out of. But it also provided important services. It offered free toilets, water for horses, free newspapers, and free lunches. And so it kept them in there, and they could interact with all the different people who were involved in the political machine and work in, basically be these cogs in these wheels of this machine that kept the power of the political machine going. Coney Island is another example of how people entertained themselves during this time period. Amusement parks are a relatively new thing in the late 1800s, and Coney Island is one of the first. It attracted working class families and single adults. This is the time period where people start to meet each other, and we start to see marriage based on attraction and love as opposed to convenience or connection between families. The amusement parks offered water slides and railroad rides. It also included all of these foreign aspects where you could see animals from strange lands. You could experience different cultures. Another area of popular culture that was very popular was sports. And most of you probably already know that basketball got its start during this time period. But baseball, or the idea of professional baseball, got its start in the early 1800s. With the Cincinnati Red Stockings being the first salaried team, in 1869. Most of you know that basketball was invented by James Naismith, and it became popular during this time, as well as football. I know that college football was rather popular at this time period. I'm not necessarily sure about any national leagues yet. Also in the early 1880s, something called vaudeville became popular. And this was a type of theater that included all these different things: animal acts, acrobats, gymnasts, and dancers. It was quite different. It's not like going to see a play or some type of performance like what we associate with theater. But this idea of this grand show being put on for you, it's very fast-paced and very much a way of gaining the audience's attention. If you've ever seen any commercials about the Cirque du Soleil, or if you've had the opportunity to see the Cirque du Soleil, vaudeville is a little bit more like that as opposed to what we would consider to be formal theater, like going out to see a play. Another development during this time period is ragtime. The most famous is going to be Scott Joplin, who became famous for I believe it was the maple rag, and I'm going to try to play that for y'all in class, but it basically used a lot of the syncopations and the rhythms from African American music, and it's going to be a precursor to jazz. So, you need to be familiar with some of the changes of this time period. So, what were some of the changes? People had more money to spend on recreation. They spent more money on entertainment and recreation. They were also willing to leave their homes to go out. They went to places like amusement parks. They enjoyed watching sports. Another sport, by the way, I did not mention was boxing as well. People were very interested in boxing matches as well. So those are ways that culturally workers' lives changed in this industrial period. So picking up where we left off, remember I told you that we were going to be jumping around in this particular time, and now we're moving on to populism. And populism is very important for you to understand what's going on with the farmers during this time period. Keep in mind, the standard talks about this change from agrarianism to industrialism. Farming had been the way of life for centuries in the United States. Now we're seeing this shift to industrialism. Farmers feel threatened, like they are losing power and control over their lives. And so this is going to be reflected in this populist movement. These key terms are very important. You need to make sure you know what populism is. You need to make sure you know what greenback is, as well as inflation, deflation, the Grange, a cooperative, the People's Party, a graduated income tax, and you will also see Goldbug, Silverite, and William Jennings Bryan. All these are going to be very important for the understanding of this particular section. And there will also be huge swaths of this on the test.
On July 4th, 1890, Leonidas L. Polk took a political gamble. He stepped up to make a speech to a crowd of 6,000 in a small town in Kansas. Polk was a Southerner, a lifelong Democrat, and a former Confederate soldier. He was not in friendly territory. Polk had come to Kansas because he was now involved in a different kind of battle, one that cut across the lines dividing Northerners from Southerners and Democrats from Republicans. He was calling on farmers from both parties and both regions to unite for their common good. Polk urged the crowd to reject the two-party system and join the emerging movement that became known as populism. I tell you this afternoon that from New York to the Golden Gate, the farmers have risen up and have inaugurated a movement such as the world has never seen. It is a revolution of thought. The farmer of North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, South Carolina is your brother. Some people have stirred up sectional feelings and have kept us apart for 25 years. They know that if we get together and shake hands, their doom is sealed. Congress could give us a bill in 48 hours that would relieve us, but Wall Street says nay. I believe that both of the parties are afraid of Wall Street.
So that's your introduction to populism, and it's going to rise out of this unrest with farmers. Farmers want to increase political powers of farmers, and they want legislation to promote their interest and to protect them. And very particularly, and this is very important for you to understand, so if you need to rewind this to review this again, please make sure that you do so. But the nation's money supply is going to cause a currency crisis for the farmers. Now, to give you some background, what's going on is that back during the Civil War, to finance the war, the federal government printed greenbacks, which is called paper currency, that could not be exchanged for gold or silver coins. You just took at face value that the money was worth what was printed on it. And it caused inflation. And now most of you already know what inflation is. Inflation is a decline in the value of money, or basically a rise in prices or an increase in prices. So the war is over. And to get inflation under control, the federal government stopped printing the greenbacks and started paying off its bonds. Adding to the problem, Congress also stopped making silver into coins. It was called the Crime of 73, or 1873 as the case may be. But during the Civil War and after, the government was buying silver from people who had discovered silver, like out west, or had silver somehow or another, and that was also a way of putting money into circulation. So all of this comes about because the federal government is losing its gold reserves because of the greenbacks and people's fear that these greenbacks were not going to be worth any money. People were buying gold, and so the government wanted to stop this loss of this gold reserve, because people would use the silver and exchange it for gold, and they would cash in their bonds for gold. Keep in mind, you couldn't cash in greenbacks for gold or silver. So, as a result of all this, remember now this is after the war, the country did not have a large enough money supply to meet the needs of this growing economy that we've been talking about, and this in turn led to deflation, which is an increase in the value of money or a general decrease in prices. Now, most of us would probably appreciate a general decrease in prices However, it was not good for farmers because most farmers were receiving lower and lower prices for their crops, and as a result they were forced to borrow money to plant their crops. In many instances they were forced to mortgage their farmsteads, like we had talked about in Chapter 13 with the homesteads, and that's how a lot of those sodbusters lost their homes. But this short supply of money caused an increase in interest rates that the farmer owed because money was harder to come by, therefore it was more expensive, and the banks charged more interest for loans. So, the farmer's solution was simple: print more greenbacks. And so they petitioned the government to print more of this paper money. And there was even a party called the Greenback Party that organized to try to make this happen. It didn't happen. People were very suspicious of the greenbacks, mostly because they were not based on any gold or silver standard, and they tended to lose their value. They were paper money. Greenbacks were considered to be what were called cheap money, which means that because people were suspicious of them, sometimes they would make you pay more of the greenbacks as opposed to having the gold or silver. And remember, the gold is harder to come by because it was in short supply. So the Greenback Party fails, and the effort to print more money fails, and so the farmers and those who support farmers say, okay, well, how about the government start to buy back silver again? Because, of course, there are large supplies of silver out west. One organization that comes around to help farmers get organized is going to be the Grange. It's a national farm organization. It's also called the Patrons of Animal Husbandry, and it was founded for social and educational purposes. But after the Panic of 1873, farmers began to turn to the Grange for assistance, and so they joined the Grange. And the Grange tried to change its focus to respond to the plight of farmers, and so it starts with this focus on the greenbacks and on the silver. So one way that the Grangers tried to help farmers was by creating cooperatives. If you've ever heard of the co-op store, it's something very similar. But cooperatives are marketing organizations that work to help its members. Very specifically for farmers, they pulled members' crops and held them off the market, trying to force the prices up. And they worked on a very limited scale. Cooperatives also were supposed to negotiate better shipping rates from railroads, because that is another problem facing the farmers. Railroads, because they held a monopoly typically in the small towns where farmers were located, they could charge whatever they wanted to for rates, and oftentimes railroads would charge higher rates for short distances as opposed to longer distances. But these cooperatives could negotiate better shipping rates from the railroads. Now, the limited success of the Grange was that in several of the western states, Granger laws, which limited railroad rates, were passed. But unfortunately, since the railroads had so much control, they refused to build any more tracks in the areas unless the law was repealed, and they restricted services. Unfortunately, the Grange is not going to be able to improve the economic conditions of the farmers, and so by the late 1870s, farmers start to leave the Grange and join other organizations that offer to help them solve their problems. Keep in mind that we talked about the new technology of farms back in Chapter 13, and this new technology led to overproduction, which is driving down their prices. And farmers have not yet figured out that they need to take crops out of production. Their mentality was, I'm getting a low price for my crops, therefore I need to grow more crops, so let me put more acres into the production of crops, and they did not realize that they were actually hurting themselves by doing that. So the question here is, how did the Grange try to help farmers? And I told you that they formed the cooperatives that tried to get a higher price for members' crops, but they also pressured state legislatures to regulate the railroads and warehouse rates. By the way, I forgot to mention the warehouses where they would store their crops until it was time to ship it. They joined the Independent National Party, or the Greenback Party that I mentioned earlier, to pressure them to print more greenbacks to ease the money supply. And then, of course, the cooperatives. So the next organization that is formed to help the farmers is going to be the Farmers Alliance. It was formed in 1877, but by 1890 it has grown to somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million members. Most of its strength is going to be the South and on the Great Plains, and most of y'all can figure out that that's because where most of the farmers are located. The Alliance organized these large cooperatives, so it's going to do the same thing that the Grange did, try to get the prices up for the crops, and they were called exchanges by the Alliance, but they also tried to make loans for farmers at low interest rates, because another problem facing the farmers are the banks. The banks are charging the farmers high interest rates for the loans that they needed to be able to get their crops in the ground. Now, the exchanges mostly failed. They overextended themselves by loaning too much money. The low interest rates, they were not repaid. Wholesalers, manufacturers, railroads, and bankers discriminated against them. And mostly, the exchanges failed because they were just simply too small to dramatically affect world prices for farm products. And that's going to be the overriding reason why they failed. So from here, farmers go to the People's Party. So members of the Kansas Alliance form what's called the People's Party of the Populists to push for political reforms that would help them solve their problems. Most Southern leaders of the Alliance are opposed to this because they don't want a third party, mostly because third parties are not very successful in American politics, but many felt that the time was ripe for this new third party. But others, particularly in the South, wanted the Democrats to retain control. One important individual out of the alliances leading to, of course, the People's Party is going to be Charles McCune. He came up with what was called the Sub-Treasury Plan, and basically this set up warehouses where farmers could store their crops to force prices up. The government would give low-interest loans to the farmers so they could go out and buy the equipment and the supplies they needed to get the crops in the ground for the next season. And then after the crops were sold, the government would give the farmer whatever profit was made, or the farmer had to pay back what the difference that was left over, because the idea was that it would make the prices higher for farmers. Why did the exchanges set up by the Farmers Alliance fail? Remember, I told you that the predominant reason is going to be that they were too small to dramatically affect world prices for farm products, but other reasons include that they had overextended themselves, they had loaned out too much money at low interest rates that was not paid back. The wholesalers, manufacturers, railroads, and bankers also discriminated against them. So, we have the rise of populism. In 1890, the Farmers Alliance issues what's called the Ocala Demands to help farmers choose candidates in the 1890 elections. And these demands include the adoption of that sub-treasury plan, the free coinage of silver, because still farmers want to have their problems eased by more money in circulation in the economy, which would cause prices to rise, an end to protective tariffs and national banks, because remember, banks charge high interest rates to farmers for their loans, and they wanted an end to protective tariffs because farmers were being hurt by the tariffs because countries around the world would charge tariffs against our goods, and so they couldn't sell their crops overseas. Also, it caused farmers to have to pay higher prices for manufactured goods. Another demand was the tighter regulation of the railroads because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, and direct election of senators by voters. As a result of all of this, many pro-alliance Democrats were elected to office in the South. But, unfortunately, the Democrats did not honor their word. They were not going to keep their promises to build the sub-treasuries, and so at this point, these pro-alliance Democrats are ready to leave the Democratic Party and join the People's Party, which becomes the Populist Party. So in July of 1892, the People's Party held its first national convention. It nominated James B. Weaver to run for president. And look at the platform that is created, and it's going to be very similar to the Ocala Demands: the unlimited coinage of silver, federal ownership of railroads, a graduated income tax. That is a tax that taxes those with higher incomes more heavily. It also called for an 8-hour workday, restriction of immigration, and denounced the use of strikebreakers. And all of that was an effort to attract workers from the North to join the Populist Party. Democrats nominated New Yorker Grover Cleveland. Cleveland won the election. Then along comes the Panic of 1893. And the Panic of 1893, we've talked about this several different times throughout our study of this time period, but it was caused by the bankruptcy of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroads. If you recognize those, it's because they're in the monopoly game. There was a stock market crash. Many of the banks closed. High unemployment, and a lot of workers are losing their jobs as well. So by 1894, the country is in a deep depression. So, to stop the flow of gold, like I mentioned earlier, President Cleveland repeals the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And that had been an effort by the Republicans to throw a bone to the farmers and say, okay, well, we'll allow the purchase of 4.5 million ounces of silver a month, but because the Treasury put the bought silver in the Treasury and did not put it in circulation, it didn't help the farmers very much. As a result of this betrayal that farmers feel by the Democratic President Grover Cleveland, the Democratic Party is going to split into the gold bugs and the silverites, and it doesn't take very much to figure out which side supports which. Gold bugs believe the American currency should be based only on gold. Silverites believe coining silver in unlimited amounts was the answer to the nation's economic crisis. So, it's very important that you know what the People's Party platform is. Remember that we said that it was the unlimited coinage of silver, federal ownership of railroads, a graduated income tax, an 8-hour workday, restriction of immigration, and the denouncement of the use of strikebreakers. So, another presidential election comes along. You have the election of 1896, and this time it's going to come down to the Democrats and the Republicans. The Populists had chosen to have its national convention last. It was going to let the Republicans have theirs, the Democrats have theirs, and then they were going to have theirs because they expected the Republicans to nominate McKinley, which they did, but they expected the Democrats to nominate Cleveland again, but this they did not do. And unfortunately, the Democrats co-opted a lot of the Populist Party platform. And so the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan for the presidential election of 1896, and he strongly supported the unlimited coinage of silver. And so, after much debate, the Populists decided that they are going to support Bryan, the Democratic candidate for president. As I mentioned, the Republicans nominated William McKinley of Ohio for president. He promised workers a full dinner pail. He is also going to have the support of the wealthy industrialists, the capitalists, and the bankers and financiers of Wall Street behind him as well. Most of these that supported McKinley believed that the unlimited coinage of silver would ruin the country's economy, and McKinley wins the election of 1896. So what happens to the Populist Party? New gold strikes in Alaska and Canada's Yukon Territory increases the supply of gold in the nation's treasury. So there was no need to buy back the silver. And basically, as the silver issue died out, so did the Populist Party, because the economy has gotten better. And therefore, the need for these reforms are not as great. So, why did William McKinley appeal to workers and business leaders? He promised workers a full dinner pail. And most business leaders like him thought that the unlimited silver coinage would ruin the country's economy. So this is the end of the section about populism. Please make sure that you have taken notes and you have those in your notebooks. I will see you in class. Have a good night. Bye-bye.